Third story. On wood dwarves, badgers, and a false impression. Dwarves are a burly bunch. Everyone in Mousewood knows that. They are excellent miners and blacksmiths. They were even designated the guardians of important bridges until trolls took over that duty. The dwarves of Mousewood, called wood dwarves, were just as accustomed to hard work, even though, from the point of view of a burly dwarf, the work often didn't seem hard at all. 3 dwarves who rarely backed away from a challenge shared a home right in the middle of Mousewood. The eldest dwarf was called Steinberg. He was 85 years old. Even by dwarf standards, he couldn't be considered green anymore, even though his father and grandfather always teased young Steinberg at family celebrations. His fellow lodgers were called Logger and Soft Steel. Logger was 73 and had a magnificent forked red beard. Soft Steel was the youngest and had just had his 71st birthday, without making much song and dance about it. Dwarves like to party loud and long, and as often as possible, just not on birthdays. Maybe because they have so many of them. The dwarves' home lay deep within the forest, half above and half below ground. There were cellars and mine shafts reaching deep under the forest floor. The dwarves drove these tunnels and shafts deeper and deeper between the roots and the earth, hoping for new pockets of precious metal or other treasures in the soil. Around their home, the 3 dwarves cultivated beds of dwarf root. Dwarf root is not a particularly small root. It's called dwarf root because only wood dwarves cultivate it, because they know how to extract the precious blue juice. Blue juice is popular among the forest dwellers for its peculiar taste and slightly unpredictable effects. In any case, no one in Mousewood would ever think of small when thinking of a dwarf. In fact, dwarves are a good deal larger than mice, squirrels, or foxes. A fox could only match a dwarf in size if it tried to walk on 2 legs, like mice and squirrels sometimes do. Okay, granted, from time to time, even foxes try to walk on 2 legs. But if you ever see a fox trying to do so, you'll immediately know why these sly fellows chose a quadrupedal life. It's like watching humans try to crawl on all 4s just for the sake of it. A ridiculous sight. In addition to their burly physique and knowledge of blue juice, there's another significant characteristic innate to all dwarves: grumpiness. No one knows why or since when. Even the dwarves themselves cannot recall, so each and every day they look for reasons to be grumpy. Actually, they'd be happy if they didn't find anything to be grumpy about, but there's always something to make them irritable. One morning, Steinberg was sitting at the kitchen table in their tidy house, waiting for his fellow lodgers. They had gone down to the cellar half an hour previously to get some honey for breakfast. The cellar is where the dwarves stored their food, since the cool, damp caves kept it fresh. Steinberg had everything already prepared. He poured out some fresh, cold milk, cut the bread into thick slices, and had a chunk of fresh butter. All that was missing was sweet, golden honey. Suddenly, Steinberg heard a loud grumbling coming from the cellar door, a grumbling he knew all too well. The dwarf already had a bad feeling about what was in store. Finally, his housemates climbed the creaking cellar stairs up to the living room and looked gloomily at Steinberg. "We're out of honey," Soft Steel said, grimly putting out the lantern he had used to illuminate the cellar's depths. You could see in his expression that for him, a breakfast without honey was no breakfast at all. "And we won't find any up here either," growled Logger, running his tongue around his mouth, silently smacking his lips, as if this could conjure up the sweet taste he now had to do without. "Pah!" exclaimed Steinberg, something the dwarves make a habit of. "Pah!" he said again, getting up from his chair. "It's always the same, I tell you. The day's ruined." He stood with hands on hips, resting them on his broad leather belt, as if he were bracing himself for another ruined day. Slowly he calmed down and grumbled, "All right, no honey then." And eventually the dwarves sat down and had breakfast, if you could call it breakfast. "Pah!" Steinberg sputtered, his mouth full. Later on, the dwarves got ready for work on the root beds. They strapped their bags for gathering ripe roots over their shoulders and picked up their hoes and shovels and everything else they needed. Without another word, the wood dwarves left the house. A cuckoo's call echoed through the trees as Steinberg, Softsteel, and Logger inspected their root beds. It looked like being a very promising harvest. Many thick dwarf roots were ripening, waiting to be turned into delicious blue juice. Softsteel began to carefully till the earth around the precious plants with his hoe. Meanwhile, Logger checked the huge harvesting baskets for holes and other damage they might have suffered during the last shift. They seemed, however, to be in immaculate condition, despite the fact that they had been outside for weeks. Before they started harvesting, though, Steinberg would always smoke a pipe, which he kept, along with his tobacco, in a pouch on his belt. He began packing the tobacco. But, just as he was about to light the pipe with a burning splint he had already lit with a lighter a relative had once crafted for him, he was startled by a yell. So startled, in fact, that his pipe fell out of his open mouth to the ground. "Hello! We need help!" a badger yelled as he ran towards the dwarf. Logger and Softsteel joined Steinberg, waiting to hear what the badger had to say. "Excuse me," the badger said, gasping for air and stumbling the last bit of the way towards the dwarves. "We've just moved into the neighbourhood," he said, gesturing nervously in a vague direction. "It's our cart. We're transporting my in-laws' furniture. If it falls over, my wife is going to—" The badger seemed to have difficulty imagining what his wife would do to him if the cart fell over. "Please come with me," he begged the dwarves. "Of course, we'll just drop everything and come and help," said Steinberg, and, with a weary sigh, tapped the remaining tobacco out of his pipe. The harvest would have to wait. The wood dwarves followed the badger to the place where he had got into difficulties. The big wooden cart was packed with old cupboards and other furniture. It was propelled by a bike-like frame fixed to the front. At least, at the moment it was fixed to the front, so long as it didn't get stuck in the mud and wasn't about to topple over, as was the case now. The badger's wife was waiting by the cart, trying to stay calm. She was not, however, having much success. As she saw her husband and the dwarves approaching, she ran up to them. "Are you here to help? The cart, do you see? Do you see?" she asked anxiously. Steinberg, Logger, and Softsteel could see the cart clearly, as it was directly in front of them. Softsteel groaned quietly. "That's my parents' furniture. It mustn't be damaged at any cost," she continued agitatedly. "It has so many memories. Do you see?" The three wood dwarves had no problem seeing. Softsteel groaned again, a little less softly. "All right, boys, let's get down to it," said Steinberg, and the dwarves began to make a plan. Logger took a look at the cart, inspecting first the sides, then the front. Softsteel examined the mud, which had swallowed two of the wheels, while Steinberg checked the consistency of the path in front of and behind them. Eventually the dwarves started to search for thick branches to lever the cart from the mud's grip. While the dwarves were busy working and planning, they noticed the badger's wife talking secretively to her husband and looking up from time to time as if she was afraid they might grow suspicious. Steinberg didn't hear particularly well, but he did have a particularly good instinct for things said behind his back. For him, it was obvious the badgers were talking maliciously about him and his fellow lodgers, and that made him extra grumpy. Using branches as levers, the burly dwarves managed to pull the cart out of the mud in one go. Then they stabilized it by covering the track with twigs and leaves so the wheels wouldn't sink in again. "All right, give it a try," said Steinberg. The badger mounted the bike and pedalled as hard as he could. Slowly the cart moved forward along the track, rattling and rolling under its heavy load. "It's worked! It's moving again!" the badger said, coughing and hastily accelerating along the path. "Sorry, but I'd better not stop," he yelled, "otherwise it might get stuck again." His wife ran up to the cart and managed to clumsily climb on, sitting down on a cupboard. And thus the cart and its load of furniture lurched and reeled down the path. When Steinberg was sure they were out of earshot, he clenched his fists and gave a loud "Pah!" Softsteel and Logger looked at him inquisitively. "Didn't you see they were talking about us behind our backs?" he asked, infuriated. Actually, they hadn't noticed, but there were two things they knew for sure. Their friend was reliable about things like that, and they didn't like things like that. The dwarves were angry. "I'm used to people only coming over here if they need our help. Really, I'm used to that," said Logger dejectedly. "But talking about us behind our backs while we're helping, that's just—" Steinberg patted the disappointed dwarf on the back. None of them could imagine what the badgers had been saying behind their backs. "They'll always come up with something," grumbled Softsteel. So, with the harvest still to be done, the wood dwarves returned to their root beds. Hour after hour they worked to the very end of the day, which gave them a few more reasons to be grumpy. They grubbed out the roots with their shovels and hoes, plucked the precious plants from the earth and put them in their harvesting bags. When the bags were full of ripe roots, they emptied them into huge baskets waiting at the edge of the fields until even they were crammed full. The dwarves didn't take a break until all the roots had been gathered and the most exhausting part of the harvest was finished. It had been a rich harvest, but none of them could derive much satisfaction from it. Steinberg sat down at the edge of the field and puffed away at his pipe. Logger, lost in thought, gnawed on a straw. Softsteel didn't even want to ponder, and spent his time cleaning the roots. Later they carried basket after basket into the house and stored them in their mine shafts, next to the machinery with which they liquidized the roots to gain the precious blue juice. They took their time on this, knowing that their thoughts would go back to the unfriendly badgers when they'd finished. Afterwards they wanted to spend the evening outside, so they took out a couple of chairs. Here, under the clear sky, they could let their thoughts roam and forget their troubles. Dusk began to fall, and in the distance birds started to sing, their songs ringing out clearly to every corner of dark and tranquil Mousewood. Gradually, a completely different sound made itself heard. An uncanny, rattling squeaking, barely audible at first, but growing in intensity until it could not be ignored. As the dwarves tried to spot the source of the noise, a faint light appeared between the trees, bumping back and forth while coming nearer. It was the badger, riding his bicycle cart. On the back stood his wife, holding something. As they arrived at the dwarves' home, the badger brought his vehicle to a halt and dismounted. "Hello again," he said. "We didn't have the chance to thank you properly. Without your kind help, we'd have been stuck forever." He then thanked every dwarf personally with a firm handshake. "Earlier on, we were wondering how we could show our gratitude," his wife said, laughing. "No easy task, I can assure you. My husband Peter said you'd probably like a blueberry tart, but I thought you'd appreciate a rhubarb cake." As she spoke, she uncovered a rhubarb cake and gave it to a very surprised Steinberg. Taken unawares, the dwarves completely forgot the fact that they didn't actually like rhubarb cake. "Again, many thanks for your kind help," the badger lady said. "It was a pleasure," replied Steinberg, as he took the freshly baked cake with a slight bow, assuming that was the right thing to do. Logger shook hands with both badgers and mumbled, deeply moved, "Welcome to the neighbourhood." What Softsteel would have liked to be a mumble, since he couldn't find the right words at this particular moment, turned out to be more of a touched sigh. With that, the badgers bade their farewells and rattled off on their cart. The wood dwarfs watched the wobbling light until it was swallowed up by the darkness. Back in their house, Steinberg put the cake right in the middle of the table and slumped down on his chair. "Pah! So they brought us a cake," he said, and eyed the cake, which, in fact, for a rhubarb cake, looked quite delicious. "Who'd have thought it? Looks like they actually brought us a cake," Logger agreed thoughtfully. Steinberg stood up and walked around the table, scratching his chin and thinking. The other dwarves looked at him expectantly, waiting to see if he had an idea. "We'll have to return the favour, or they might think we're bad neighbours," the oldest dwarf said firmly. And, as he said it, he gestured towards the cellar door, where the freshly harvested dwarf roots were stored. Later on, the dwarves celebrated and ate the rhubarb cake with great pleasure. It had a very special taste, one you could really get used to. Then they raised their root beer-filled mugs to the new neighbours. Far into the night, the dwarfs' home was filled with bright light, and thick blue steam spiralled into the night sky. And for quite some time, the rattling and sizzling of machinery could be heard coming from the cellar, as the first drops of the new season's blue juice were bottled.